morning, everyone. I'm 인주 Son, Deputy Director of Institute for Future Strategy, 서울대 국가미래전략원. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to Seoul National University. Even a greater pleasure to welcome Professor Gerald Rowland from UC Berkeley. Professor Rowland is a rare breed. Political economist trained to see both the numbers and politics. One can say economists see the world in numbers and political science see in debates. Today, we get the best of both in one person, Professor Rowland. Professor Rowland is an expert on traditional economies who has spent his careers explaining what happens when countries shift from one system to another. In other words, he is the perfect person to help us make sense of today's transitional world order. Professor Gerald Rowland served as editor of Journal of Comparative Economics. He was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Science in Stanford. He also program chair of 5th Nobel Symposium in Economics. This morning, he will guide us through several big questions. What does the Trump presidency reveal about the future of international order? Will the world be carved into 3 spheres of influence, US, China, and Russia? What's the really behind Trump's tariff policy? And how do these global storms land here in Korean Peninsula? Following his lecture, we will hold a question and answer session with SNU Chair Professor Kim Byung-yeon serving as a moderator. At SNU, we often say that the best lectures make us think harder and laugh a little and sometimes worry a lot. I suspect today we will do all 3, thinking, laughing, and worrying about international order in the age of Trump. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Rowland.
So thank you very much for these nice words. It's also nice to be back. I've been many times at Seoul National University. I've worked with your colleague Kim Byung-yeon, and so I'm happy to be back. It's been quite a while, and things have been moving. Oh, louder, yeah. Okay. So today, indeed, we have lots of questions. It's not clear that we have the answers, but certainly, we have to try and make sense of what is happening in the world. Again, these last few days has been like emotional roller coaster with President Trump receiving Putin in Alaska in the US, where he's actually indicted in the world for war crimes. And a few hours ago, we got news from what happened in the White House, in the Oval Office, with President Zelensky from Ukraine, backed by leaders from European countries. And we cannot say that this brings much clarity. It brings probably even more questions. And so, to put things into perspective, the re-election of Donald Trump has really raised many questions about the future of the international order. And that is something that is very important for the whole world, but especially in regions like, the Korean Peninsula, Southeast Asia, which basically are faced with lots of challenges. So when Trump was elected, he made open declarations of the intent to take over Greenland, something completely unexpected, saying we will take Greenland, and not even asking the Danish government. Also made open declarations about transforming Canada into the 51st state, which again, very, very shocking to many people. And he also made declarations about Panama, even though that was less covered by the media, but essentially criticizing the Chinese presence in the Canal of Panama and making threats, making again territorial threats relative to Panama. Now, this is just the first of a long list of things that have been happening only in, let's say, the last 6 months in the world. President Trump has been bullying nations with tariffs. And the latest examples are Brazil and India. Brazil, because Trump is not happy with the fact that former President Bolsonaro is indicted for trying to stage a coup, at least it's the accusation. India being bullied because they're trading in oil with Russia, and so the US say, you should not do that, and therefore we're going to punish you. Of course, there's been bullying of Switzerland, bullying of the EU. The list is very, very long, and who knows what will happen when President Lee meets President Trump, actually in probably less than 10 days. So there's a lot of uncertainty related to that. Trump has had an ambiguous attitude towards Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. We've just seen it these last few days. But clearly it makes people afraid. It creates uncertainty. We don't know, how much President Trump is on the side of Putin or not. So there's a lot of ambiguity there, and I think ambiguity is probably a euphemism, because some people say he's actually more friendly to Putin and Russia than to Ukraine and Zelensky. There's also an ambiguous attitude towards the Taiwan question. This has been less covered, but for example, the recent episode where the Taiwanese president was forbidden to fly over US territory is something that has been seen as worrying, sort of to all international observers, and precisely because of Trump's changing attitude, there's a clear fear that the US may not back Taiwan militarily in case of a Chinese threat. And then there's also been an ambiguous attitude towards US traditional allies. It's been the case with European countries. It's been the case with Japan. I think it's also, the case with South Korea. And this is something that, people are shocked because they're absolutely not used to that. So now, when thinking about those things, we have to make the difference between, on one hand, Trump's personality, but also new and possibly lasting trends in the international arena. So Trump's personality is one thing. We can talk at length about, his character flaws, about his view of the world, but in case US democracy survives the Trump presidency, which is likely, but it's not necessarily 100% likely, people say, well, Trump will be gone in a few years, so what's going to happen? So I think we have to make the difference between what is on one hand, Trump's personality, but also whether there are new and possibly lasting trends in the international arena. And so what we've seen with trends, with Trump, how much is that, purely idiosyncratic, but also what are kind of deep undercurrents that may be behind that, and how can we make the difference between what is specific to Trump, but also possible longer trends in U.S. Foreign affairs policy. Now, it's quite clear, what we've seen with Russia's intents. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has laid bare Putin's imperial ambitions, and Putin has explained that the collapse of the Soviet Union was, in his view, the biggest catastrophe that had happened to his country, and made clear that Russia has imperial ambitions and wants to go back to that. So if I can say a few words about Russia, Russia is a relatively, really young country, a young empire. It's been there only for a few hundreds of years. It goes back to Ivan III, who was Duke of Muscovy, but very quickly Russia has expanded its territory to become a big empire in the 19th century already, and probably in the 20th century under Stalin, Russia under the Soviet Union reached probably its apex, sort of. Now, to understand Russia's imperial ambitions, they have always been there, but one has to see kind of the underlying factors here. So, Russia, as you know, has the biggest territory in the world. The largest number of time zones, etc. But we also know that most of the Russian population is on the western side, and the ambitions have always been, even though Russia has been colonizing huge territories in the Asian part of Russia, but Russia's ambitions have been mostly towards the west. And so one thing that many scholars have noticed is that, if you look at Russia's ambitions since the 19th century, because the northern seas are not navigable because of the low temperatures, the big imperial ambitions have always been to try to move and to get control of territories both on the Baltic Sea and in the Mediterranean. So those have been ambitions of Russia's empire since the 19th century, and they were actually, you can go back to World War I, and some of these ambitions were already quite clear. Now, as I said, it's under Stalin that Russia probably got the maximum power. It did have control over the Baltics. It had the Baltic states. It had East Germany. It had Poland. A direct control over those countries. Finland had a special neutrality status, and same thing for Sweden, that was not part of NATO. So it's quite clear that at the time of Stalin, Russia had quite good control over access to the Baltic Sea. On the Mediterranean, it was less successful. Access to the Mediterranean is one reason why Russia strongly supported Serbia before and during World War I. But Mediterranean access was also always very important for Russia. And there they were less successful, even under Stalin. For one, Yugoslavia under Tito was not willing to become a vassal state of the Soviet Union. Stalin was absolutely furious at Tito, tried to get him assassinated many times. The last time they attempted, Stalin died before it was implemented, but certainly Soviet Union did not get control over Yugoslavia. The other failure was the Greek Civil War. Just after World War II, there was the Greek Civil War. The communists could have won, then Soviet Union would have had access to the Mediterranean, but it did not happen. So that was another failure. The fact that Turkey became member of NATO is a big failure. for Russia. And so the only compensation they got in their access to the Mediterranean was to have a military naval base in Syria. And now with the change of regime in Syria, we don't really know what's going to happen. But those were certainly the ambitions, and so Russia's imperial ambitions have always been towards the West, and that explains what we see in Ukraine, and why is very dangerous. If they win in Ukraine, they could go to Moldova, the Baltics, Poland. Those countries would really be next in line, and we don't know where they could stop. So that's clearly Russia's imperial ambitions in today's world is very clear for everybody. We have to understand that. What about China? So after the takeover of Hong Kong under the national security law, it's quite clear. China never made, always made it quite clear that they want to take over Taiwan. That Taiwan is part of China. For them, there's no question about that. But then there's a question about, China's geopolitical ambitions, and South Korea being a neighbor to China. Of course, this is something very important. China's imperial ambitions are very different from those of Russia. Like Russia, China has colonized territories, for Tibet since 1949, or others depending on what time you're looking at. But the colonization happened, in the western part. In Russia, it was in the eastern part of Russia. In China, it was the western part of China. But if you want to look at China's geopolitical ambitions, it's quite interesting to look at history. And if you look at history, China's imperial ambitions follow a very Confucian logic. In the sense, China is the empire of the middle. China is a bit like the sun, and with satellites, with planets turning around China. And so China is in the middle, and then there would be tributary states. That's the notion of tributary states, which was very important in the Qing dynasty. There were times where Korean Peninsula was actually tributary states to China. There's, Vietnam, other countries, etc. But this is really the concept. It's not necessarily invading other countries, so which is different from maybe Russia's ambitions, but China's imperial ambitions is to have around itself tributary states, and in a Confucian order, friend number one, friend number two, friend number three, like in the ranking, very Confucian style ranking, where you have the best friend, number two, etc. And this is kind of the view of the world, which doesn't necessarily entail invasion, but does entail some kind of making countries dependent on China. And so to the extent that you can be dependent on China, they can put pressure on you. So don't criticize us. So imposing censorship to the outside world. And again, there's a very Confucian logic. So China sees themselves as the benevolent parents, and smaller countries as children who could be rowdy, and children should not criticize their parents. So otherwise you need to give them a lesson. So that's really the view. And if a country like Australia or Lithuania or any other country would try to do something that the Chinese don't like, then it's these children need to be taught a lesson. They need to be punished. Now this is China's sort of a view of the world. Now of course the U.S. does not fit there. The U.S. cannot be transformed into tributary states. So inevitably this logic leads to big rivalry with the U.S. Whether it's said openly or not, the U.S. does not fit into that view of the world. Now, that's Russia and China. They're pretty kind of well known. But what about the U.S.? And so I'm going to try to think with you given what we've seen recently, what will be the role of the US under Trump and possibly afterwards, which is probably, if we take the long run view, is probably what matters the most for us. And so, what I'll try to do is I'll try to make sense of US international policy under Trump and beyond. I will also speak a little bit about the meaning and effect of Trump's tariff policies. I think this is something that is very specific to Trump, that may not necessarily last, or at least the philosophy will not last. And then finally, I will discuss how these changes in the international order may affect the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And there I hope we can have a discussion, because there's a lot of unknowns, and many of you probably have better insights than I have about this situation. So, to try to understand, the US under Trump, a useful way is to go back to what was called the Monroe doctrine. So anybody who has studied a little bit the history of the US knows that the Monroe doctrine was something very important. In 1823, President Monroe elaborated what is called the Monroe Doctrine, stating that the Americas were close to European colonization. So hands off the Americas. And that at the same time, the US was not interested in intervening in European affairs. So that's essentially, I mean, you can go a little bit more, but that's essentially the Monroe Doctrine. And so the Monroe Doctrine has been interpreted in different ways. One interpretation, which I think was probably the original one, was an isolationist, anti-colonial interpretation. And so the US, having been a colony from Britain, they had liberated themselves from English colonialism. And so there was not great sympathy among the new American elites for colonialism, and this was the early 19th century was really a big period in colonialism, and so that was something very important, and so the U.S. could, from that perspective, be seen as an anti-colonial power, having liberated themselves from the U.S. They would not tolerate further colonial intervention in the Americas. And that had implications also for Latin America. This would say, Europeans, hands off, also Latin America, we will not tolerate any kind of colonial intervention. So that's one interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. Let's call it the isolationist interpretation. And then there's the imperialist interpretation. The imperialist interpretation goes like this, to say, well, hands off Americas, because that's reserved for us. Americas is for the US, okay? And so, this is our reserved hunting field. And so colonial powers, they should be looking elsewhere. They can go to Asia, they can go to Africa, but hands off the Americas. And so Theodore Roosevelt, who was president in the early 20th century, he used more the imperialist interpretation. They tried to take over Cuba. This failed. They took over the Philippines, but that didn't last. That didn't last very long. So overall, if you look at sort of U.S. U.S. colonial history is not very big, and so I think there is room for interpretation along those two lines. I think we can. There is something true in both the isolationist interpretation, but there's also something true in the imperialist interpretation. And I think, if you look at the U.S. history after World War II, when it became, huge power, I think there the imperialist interpretation, especially, with the Cold War, etc., fit more many of the facts. But I think that you have to keep in mind those two interpretations. So how do we understand Trump in that context? So Trump right now seems, again, this is not certain, seems to lean in the imperialist direction. And so if we take that interpretation, that means the US would claim the right to exercise control over the American continent, and that would make sense of the declarations about Greenland, Canada, and Panama. So far, those have only been words, but words matter a lot in politics. But with Trump, you know, there's so many words coming out of his mouth, so it's not clear what we should believe. And part of that interpretation, and it's been highlighted, that if the US claims control over the Americas, then the Chinese should abstain from intervening in Latin America, because indeed, you know, Chinese are very present in Latin America. They build ports, they're very strong in trade, they're the biggest trade partner for many countries, but that could be an intervention. Whether this is going to be successful or not, that's a completely different question. So if they think that by bullying Brazil, they're going to bring Brazil less close to China, that's completely misguided, because it's going to exactly have the exactly have the other effect. If Brazil has 50% tariffs, then they'll trade less with the US, and of course they will lean much more towards China, and they're part of the BRICS club, so this would make sense from the point of view of Brazil. But anyway, you know, whether it's successful or not, this could be this interpretation, imperialist interpretation. But now, a corollary of that interpretation is that if this is an imperialist view, that means the US claims control over the Americas, and what about the two big other empires, Russia and China? People may ask me, what about India? I can say a few words about India, but India is not really an imperialist power at this stage, even though it's a very, very large country. And so a corollary is that Russia and China could have their own sphere of influence. Russia could have basically say over what's happening in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, possibly Europe. You know, Russia, depending on how successful, may try to recover some of the former territories it had control over during the Cold War, and they may exert pressure or have influence on what's going on inside the European Union. People say, oh, but you know, Russia is not going to invade France, they're not going to invade Spain, they're not going to invade Italy. That's right, but it's not necessarily the issue. Russia has been very actively present in supporting anti-EU parties inside the European Union. So they see clearly, for Russia, the European Union is a big enemy. Why? Because, you know, in Ukraine, everything started in 2014 with a desire of the population to, at some point, enter the European Union. Inside Belarus, there's also very strong pro-European sentiment, and you know, the grass is always greener in your neighbor's garden, and so people in Eastern Europe, they clearly see the economic success of the European Union. They see how Poland has increased its income per capita in the last few decades, and the EU is a tremendous economic power. And so even if Russia would not want to, let's say, invade necessarily you know, West European countries, it may still want to use its leverage, its power, to influence politics in various countries, and it may be successful. So the next French president may be Marine Le Pen, and Marine Le Pen is known to have had rather pro-Russian attitudes. She even got money. Her party got money from Russia to support their campaign. So the Russian influence you know, could be direct and indirect, but essentially, so from the point of view of the US, if they say, well, you know, okay, so we're controlling, you know, Americas, we'll let Russia do what they want in Europe. So that would be essentially the interpretation. What about China, then, in that point of view? If the world should be divided in different spheres, the US would let China have a strong influence over East Asia, and control over Taiwan could potentially be negotiated, in a deal where you let China take over Taiwan, but then US receives something in exchange, etc. And this is certainly not to be excluded. So this imperialist interpretation would really be a sense of dividing the world into three distinct spheres of influence. There are consequences. If that is the case, again, I say if that is the case, because we have to start thinking about it, several implications, strong implications should follow from that. First of all, this means that international relations will be governed only by balance of power considerations, in a way the rule of the jungle. The stronger one wins, and might makes right, as they say. And then smaller countries will be victims of imperialist powers. And of course, if you're part of a smaller country, if you're not one of those three big imperial powers, this is very dangerous, and this is certainly a big cause of concern. Second implication that we can draw from this is that trade will be used more and more as a geopolitical tool with increased economic uncertainty. So it's quite clear, I'll come back to that a bit later when talking about the tariffs, but Trump has been using the tariffs certainly with a geopolitical intention, saying, if you don't do this, I will increase tariffs by 15% or 50%, etc. And so trade could be used more and more as a geopolitical tool. And so these two first aspects are really very worrying, because after World War II, with the United Nations, with the building of the international order, there has been the attempt, and I insist on this word, the attempt to try to build a rules-based order. Now, many Americans use this word rules-based order, but the Americans are among those that have been the least following this. So depending on whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration, they would either insist on the rules-based order or say, no, the US has its own rules, and the US is completely sovereign. The US should not be told in any way what it should be doing. Same thing with trade. The big success of the post-war era has been really international trade, which has been a key element in the success. So, for example, Japan, South Korea, China, all of East Asia, their economic success is very linked to the export-oriented strategies in a world where there's a lot of free trade. I mean, the world never had complete free trade, but where there was more and more free trade. And when trade becomes more geopolitical, there's going to be more uncertainty, and though this brings us backwards. So there's a danger that we are brought backwards in terms of international relations, but also that we're brought backwards in terms of international trade. Another implication is that the US does not prioritize the traditional alliances with democratic countries in Europe and in Asia, and may even abandon some of them to Russia and China. And so this is one of the things that is most shocking. Trump doesn't care whether a country has a democratic order or autocratic order. He really doesn't care. He says, I'm just going to do business. I'm a business person. I don't care about that. But this is extremely shocking, because democracy is really, there's a lot of values behind democracy. Democracy has been actually moving forward after World War II, after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So democracy has been advancing in the world, and there's also theories about democratic peace. Democracies don't fight with each other, And so democracy should likely be natural allies because they share similar values about universal human rights, about human rights, etc., etc. And so this came as something very shocking. European countries, would be treated like, not traditional allies, which they had been since the end of World War II. Same thing with Japan and South Korea. All of a sudden, they were, traditionally big allies of the U.S., and so the sharing of democratic regime has been very important. But now, all of a sudden, this may disappear and may give way to pure balance of power relations, which of course is very, very worrying. So another implication is about the EU. The European Union is actually seen as an obstacle to US influence. Now, Europeans actually, I think, was good that they went to visit Trump, last few hours together with Mrs. von der Leyen, and so that was probably something rather good. But on the whole, I think it's fair to say that the attitudes in the US towards the EU on part of the Trump administration is not friendly. Vice President Vance came to Munich and basically said, "You guys are censoring extreme right parties. That's not okay. This is not." And just recently, a report came out saying that democracy was basically going down in Europe, and the main argument is that extreme right parties are being censored. And so in Europe, we think it's a good thing. We don't want sort of pro-Nazi parties to, come back to government. We're very scared. I mean, in Europe, we're very scared of that because we know the past, we know the history. But behind all that is not just because there could be an affinity between the Trump administration, which is very much to the extreme right, and extreme right parties inside Europe, or the Reform Party in the UK. But the EU as such is seen as an obstacle to US influence. The US would, of course, prefer to deal individually with smaller countries rather with the EU as a bloc. And people in the EU kind of know that, and they would like the opposite, because they think that if they can act together, which is not always easy, they could be stronger, because the EU is an economic giant, but it's a political dwarf. That's something relatively well known, and people understand that, but they want to get past this. Another implication, I would say, is that the African continent will be up for grabs between China, Russia, and the US. Because if you see this division of the world, say, Europe's sphere of influence of Russia, Americans for the US, and Asia for China, of course, this is a very rough sketch. What about Africa? No, Africa, there's nothing there. China is very present in Africa, is trying to get as many natural resources from African countries in exchange for infrastructure investment. Russians are very active militarily. They've been chasing the French, and so the Wagner, or now it has a different name, Foreign Legion or something, is very active there. And the US has now a renewed appetite for Africa. In the past decades, US was less invested in Africa because of the weak states that you see, and the difficulties with dealing with these weak states. But now Trump, he looks at natural resources. He doesn't care about governments, and so there are lots of natural resources in Africa, and the US wants to be part of it. So this is not good. This is not good for Africa, because Africa would actually be up for grabs between these three big powers. Of course, there's no question that this would go together with a higher likelihood of global conflicts. Precisely when you use power relations at some point, you want to use real power. and a conflict can quickly escalate. So, and if you don't have, or if you've destroyed the existing international order, it makes the likelihood of conflict larger. And the UN was precisely created with that purpose, and UN can be criticized, but if you destroy the UN, not much good is going to come out of that. Finally, last but not least, with this change in the world order, of course, the fight against climate change is really off the table with terrible future consequences. We know about that. This is kind of the silent danger with low frequency events, but that is moving very strongly. And we know that only concerted international action, cooperation, is the only way to get around it. And we haven't been doing a good job. Sort of the COP conferences have not been doing enough. But what's been happening in recent months destroys the consensus that has been building on those things. Now, given this version of possibly, division of the world between great empires, but I have to say that for the US, this is not a complete picture. The US acts both as an empire, we see evidence of that, but is also a democracy. The US is still a democracy. I mean, it's under attack under Trump, but democracy is being undermined in the US, but it's still a democracy. And I can talk a bit more about that, but civil society is very strong in the US. Another aspect that's very strong in the US is the US is a federal country, which means that the states can have power. And I would bet probably that after the Trump presidency, there will be moves in the US to try to reduce the powers of the presidency, which have kind of been increasing since Lincoln, and thinking that US should become more decentralized. Now, the problem is that as an empire, the US has enormous bargaining power. And so when countries yield to Trump, say, okay, yeah, you increase our tariffs, we get 50%, that's great, we don't have 30%, we're very happy, 50% instead of 30%, because they know that they don't have much bargaining power, because given the huge economic and military influence of the US. But as a democracy, the US has its isolationist tendencies. They're very clearly visible. And still, apart from Trump and his entourage, I would say that among the political elite in the US, there is still mostly a very positive attitude towards the traditional allies in Europe and Asia. So that is still the case. That's not going away. But Trump has broken the trust of US allies. Now we don't trust him. We don't know what he's going to do. We don't know what he's going to do in Ukraine. We don't know what he's going to do in Taiwan. We can't really trust him. And so successors to Trump may or may not behave like him, but the trust is gone. And I think this is certainly very bad, and it would take a long time to rebuild it. And so that's kind of very worrying. Now, question behind this, since we know that the big rivalry is between the US and China, the question is China winning? Is China winning? And here I have to say, I'm really quite an opponent of Xi Jinping's regime and not at all sympathetic to that. Unfortunately, I would say the answer is mostly yes for now, that China is winning. But it's not because of China's moves. China has lots of problems of its own, so I could talk for half an hour about China's problems, from the public finance system to the lack of innovation, to the attacks on the private sector, to the demographic evolution, etc. But the fact that China may be winning is mostly due to the self-destructive policies that Trump has been imposing. And so, just to name a few, there's a frontal attack on science, basically attack on healthcare, the appointment of Robert Kennedy, the huge attack on healthcare, the attack on universities, the American universities has been, really at the forefront of science in the world, attracting a lot of people, and there's a frontal attack on universities. The closing of borders and the closing of immigration. Immigration has always been one of the strengths of the US, because they have attracted not only labor from other countries, but they've attracted human capital, and that's been fundamental. And so science and immigration are one of the reasons behind the huge economic power of the US. Same thing with the self-destructive economic policies of tariff. There's no single serious economist who would say that these are the right policies. They are self-destructive. They create a lot of harm. Trump has been engaging in the destruction of the state apparatus and transformation into a patrimonial, personalistic state. So there were rules inside the government administration. It was kind of, rules-based administration, which is kind of a good thing. That's, since Max Weber, we know that's what modern bureaucracy should be. They should be based on impersonal rules that people can rely on. Instead, it's all becoming about loyalty. Everything is related to your loyalty. You transform it into what is called the patrimonial, personalistic state, which is how mafias are run, which is how banana republics are run. And so if you look at China, China is a strong dictatorship, but China has impersonal rules. China, even if you go back to the legalistic tradition in China, which counts on the state to repress its citizens, is based on rules. And so, rules-based states are actually stronger than those that are based on personal loyalties. There's been attacks on the independence of judiciary, attacks on freedom of expression, destruction of trust with traditional allies. And so I would say those policies are catastrophic, and they undermine, it's shooting yourself in the foot, they undermine the position of the US, and of course, they benefit China, relatively speaking. And so let me say a few words about the tariffs. And this is, again, I would say the tariffs is something specific to Trump, and after Trump, things may be quite different. So first, there's wrong ideas. Wrong ideas. And so wrong ideas very often rule the world. Most ideas that we come up with are generally wrong, and fortunately, at least in democratic societies, in societies that are based on loyal and true debates, we can eliminate the wrong ideas. It's very important to eliminate the wrong ideas. And so Trump has this mistaken view about government revenues and the effect of tariffs. Trump would like to go back to the 19th century, where in 19th century America, tariffs were the main source of revenue. So why does he like that? Because if tariffs are the main source of revenue, then you can get rid of the income tax. Indeed, there was no income tax. Income tax came much later, and income tax has introduced, progressivity in income taxation, and he doesn't like that. So it's really trying to go back to a fiscal structure that you see these days only in some developing countries, but that were there historically. And so these are wrong ideas. Public finance people, of course, would tell you that's completely wrong. And so these wrong ideas are combined with a mistaken view about reindustrializing the US. The US is a post-industrial society. We should still rely on comparative advantage. Trying through tariffs to kind of induce other countries to invest in the US is not going to work. And so any serious economist would tell you that. But the Trump sycophants, they just repeat the idea that that tariffs are there to force, to induce other countries to invest in the U.S. The second factor, which of course is quite clear, I don't need to talk too much about that, using tariffs as a bullying tool. And so, apart from the fact that it's wrong, that it's imperialistic, that it's bullying, this is extremely deleterious to the international order, because again, it shows might makes right, and so the strong can bully the weaker. So when Trump goes out of office and if the US still remains a democracy, I don't think there will be new tariffs, but it could be that these tariffs stay for a long time. After the first Trump presidency, when Biden was elected, people expected the Trump tariffs from the first presidency to disappear, but that was not the case. That was not the case because you've created vested interests, and it's not clear how quickly this might be undone. So now let me finish by talking about the Korean Peninsula. And so unfortunately here the news have not been good in the last few years. North Korea became a nuclear power, has increased aggressive behavior towards South Korea, even reviving the dream of attacking it again, even though we know that's a chimera, that's only a dream, but still it's scary. Now, its military alliance with Russia and Ukraine is beneficial to North Korea economically, but also politically, as a tightening of relations with Russia makes North Korea less dependent on China. And I think everybody understands that, and so this is all for the benefit of the North Korean regime. Also, geopolitical changes make the reliance on US military support in South Korea less certain at a time when North Korea became militarily stronger. Also, the internal crisis in South Korea, precipitated by the actions of former President Yoon, have created doubts over political stability in South Korea. So all this is not very good news, unfortunately. And so South Korea is at risk of being sucked in China's sphere of influence and becoming de facto a tributary state, as I explained a bit earlier. And South Korea may not have many other choices, and it will have to manage very carefully the Beijing-Seoul relationship. And I think this is something that people have to think very hard about, but certainly it cannot be ignored, and certainly here there needs to be a lot of thinking about that. At the same time, South Korea should continue broadening diplomatic relations with other Asian countries. Relations between South Korea and Japan have improved, but not enough to represent some counterweight to China's influence. And certainly urgent steps would be needed on both sides, and any progress there would be certainly desirable, even though it's much too slow, and we understand why. There's a lot of historical baggage. It's all very complicated, but if you look towards the future, it's clear that Japan and South Korea need to strengthen their ties with look not towards the past, but towards the future. Now, some people may think, well, if South Koreans companies invest more in the US, this can provide some solution, in terms of binding South Korea-US relationship, which is quite fundamental for this country. This can help. It can also help politically to maintain stability, but it's not going to be a panacea. And I suspect Trump may ask South Korea to pay much more for the presence of US troops, and that's something that is to be expected and managed. Now, some ideas have been floating of developing nuclear weapons by South Korea. And after thinking about it, I think this would be likely to create even more instability, and especially in light of everything else that's happening, would probably have catastrophic consequences. And so here I think the only reasonable approach is to reaffirm as much as possible the protection by the US nuclear umbrella as kind of what one should be pushing for. Now, a new approach to negotiations with North Korea without creating illusions, like under President Moon, would be welcome. The recent rejections of negotiations by North Korea should not be seen as a discouragement, and having active lines of communication is important. It seems little, but these you have to keep to a minimum. There's little hope for big moves, so I think we should not have too many illusions, or even of some return of the sunshine policy. The fact that Kaesong remains closed, I think, is a clear indicator that we're still very far from coming back there, but small steps can be helpful. And so in the light of uncertainty over future US commitments, it's also important to avoid appearing weak. And so new wave of defense spending may be necessary, especially if the US intends to reduce its presence or its own military spending in South Korea. Moves to accelerate the transfer of OPCON would be desirable, but also one should be flexible. Simultaneous proposals to make concessions to North Korea on military drills may be a good idea, as possible small steps to reduce tension. These are just a few ideas. Now, while the presence of US troops in South Korea is of strategic importance, South Korea has to manage carefully its political relations with China. So in the past, one idea was that South Korea would do a lot of trade with China and get political support from the US. This should no longer be the way we should look at things. South Korea should make political steps towards China because of geography. They have to have a relatively good relations. And South Korea should not be too economically dependent on China. That's certainly a lesson that we've learned in relation to China's hegemonic ambitions. So overall, there's little to expect in the near future in the North-South Korean relations, but I think steps by South Korea to engage more with China on Northeast Asia would seem to be the most promising at this stage, precisely because North Korea has engaged now in a move towards Russia. It could be time for South Korea to respond by some steps to get closer politically to China. Also, let's not forget, China is now the most likely or the least unlikely country to be able to do something about North Korea's nuclear program. Because there are joint interests here. Of course, we should not ignore what China is, but there are joint interests there. And so finally, as I said, South Korea should not become dependent on trade with China. This could be used as political leverage. At the same time, South Korea has no interest in antagonizing China. So diplomatic relations here are important. Now, one idea that can be discussed is that active South Korean support for Ukraine could be a welcome development as well. It's a new idea, but it may give leverage to South Korea. Also, in light of that idea, more active economic and political relations with the EU should be promoted. And in a world dominated by three big powers, mid-sized countries should work more with each other to avoid dependence on big powers, not just in Asia, but also outside Asia. In the same spirit, more active relations with NATO would be welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your lecture and conversations. Would you join me by giving our thanks to Gerard by big hands? Thank you so much.